Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that reeks of mystery. Literally. Vikings shocked the medieval world by being considered clean, but the truth behind their hygiene rituals is stranger, grosser, and far more revealing than you've ever been told. You'll soon find out why their combs weren't just for styling, and how their beds were alive in ways you don't want to think about. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these dives into history. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in a Viking longhouse in the 9th century. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, so are the lice. Your bedding is a sack of straw that smells like goat fur, because it probably is goat fur. It scratches at your skin while tiny fleas bounce around your ankles like they're at a medieval rave. The blanket on top of you is stiff with grease, soot, and maybe last winter's stew. It doesn't so much warm you as pin you down like a dead animal hide. You sit up, cough, and instantly regret it. The fire in the centre of the longhouse never truly went out, so smoke drifts lazily through the rafters, staining the air and your lungs at the same time. Your eyes sting, your hair reeks, you smell like both a fireplace and a barnyard, and that's before you've even had breakfast. But here's the kicker. This choking, bug-ridden sauna of misery is considered clean by medieval standards. You think the longhouse smells bad when you first crawl out of bed, but nothing prepares you for the moment when nature calls, and nature always calls. There is no porcelain throne, no cushioned seat, and definitely no toilet paper waiting politely in a roll. Viking toilets were not just primitive, they were an education in humility, public shame, and the resilience of your stomach. Archaeologists have uncovered Viking latrines that were little more than pits dug into the earth, sometimes lined with wood planks if someone felt fancy. You would squat, do your business, and leave it to slowly ferment in the ground. A family might share the same pit for weeks, creating what was essentially an open-air compost heap of human misery. The stench was unholy, the flies relentless, and in the summer months it became a breeding ground for worms and parasites that did not politely stay outside your body. Studies of Viking feces found in these latrines have revealed roundworm and whipworm eggs, meaning the Vikings were recycling parasites with grim efficiency. Privacy was not part of the deal. Many homes had small outhouses attached, but in settlements or camps, relieving yourself could mean crouching in a communal corner, side by side with others. Imagine small talk while trying not to breathe too deeply. The smell was enough to cling to your clothing, a permanent reminder that hygiene in the Viking world was a battle no one could win. Yet this was still more sophisticated than the reality in many medieval towns, where waste was often thrown directly into the street. At least Viking pits kept the chaos somewhat contained. You begin to understand why their grooming habits mattered so much. A weekly bath or a fresh combing session was not just vanity, it was survival. When the air is filled with the aroma of shared latrines and unwashed wool, any attempt at cleanliness is the difference between being tolerable and unbearable. This is also why Norse settlements often placed their latrines near streams or rivers. Waste flowed outward, downstream, ideally towards someone else. Pollution was less a concern than convenience, and waterways became both lifeline and sewer. The idea of wiping yourself was equally grim. There was no paper, no soft linen, no soap. Wiping could mean grabbing straw, moss, a scrap of wool, or nothing at all if supplies were short. The fragments of cloth sometimes used were washed and reused, a habit that makes the modern concept of laundry feel like a miracle. And if you were out raiding, waste disposal often meant the sea. The longship doubled as a toilet, with warriors squatting over the side while waves and salt spray attempted to clean up after them. Imagine the intimacy of sailing for weeks in a wooden boat, while your crewmates relieved themselves within arm's reach. It was less a voyage than a floating septic tank with oars. This was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. The presence of parasites and bacteria meant stomach ailments were constant companions. Dysentery, diarrhea and fevers were as much a part of the Viking experience as axes and shields. The fact that so many of them survived long voyages is proof of their resilience, or perhaps of their immune systems adapting to filth most of us could not survive. When medieval chroniclers described the fearsome Vikings, they rarely mentioned that these warriors were also walking petri dishes. Now picture the impact of this on daily life. You wake in the smoky longhouse, your stomach churns from last night's rancid fish stew, and your only option is to head to a pit that smells like the devil's own soup pot. You crouch, you breathe shallowly, you finish quickly, and you leave before the flies decide you're part of the feast. Then you return to your bed, your hair slicked with butter, your clothes smoky from the fire, and your body carrying the invisible legacy of parasites waiting to be passed on. It is easy to laugh at the absurdity, but these habits shaped Viking society. Waste management was primitive, but it allowed communities to grow larger than many of their medieval neighbours. Latrine pits meant that disease, while common, did not reach the catastrophic levels of towns where sewage simply ran through the streets. In its own grotesque way, the Viking toilet was a small step toward public health. It was not glamorous, it was not clean, but it was effective enough to keep settlements alive. Of course, there was a social element too. The placement of latrines near communal areas meant that waste disposal became part of the shared rhythm of life. Children, elders, warriors all contributed to the same pits. It created a strange equality, a reminder that no matter how rich your raids or how finely carved your comb, everyone squatted the same way in the same stinking hole. The archaeological record confirms this, with latrine pits containing the remains of every age group. As your stomach finally settles and you step away from the pit, you realise that this was only one part of Viking hygiene. The battle against filth was constant, and it did not end when you left the latrine. Because once you emerged from the stink of waste, you still had to face the equally pressing problem of clothing. Viking garments absorbed every smell, every drop of sweat, and every hint of smoke, turning them into mobile archives of filth. And how those garments were washed, or not washed, is the next horror waiting for you. When you leave the pit behind, you're not exactly escaping filth. The real problem follows you everywhere because you are literally wearing it. Viking clothing was practical, durable, and endlessly filthy. Every stitch held onto the longhouse smoke, every fibre soaked up sweat, and every fold caught crumbs of fish and grease. Imagine walking around wrapped in a sponge that never dries and never gets properly cleaned. That was the Viking wardrobe. Wool was the main fabric of choice, heavy and scratchy, but it could survive the wet northern climate. Linen was used for undergarments if you could afford it, though calling them clean is generous. Washing linen was slightly easier, but wool posed a nightmare. To clean it, Vikings sometimes used lye soap made by boiling animal fat with ash, creating a caustic mixture strong enough to peel skin if you handled it wrong. It worked, but it also meant that freshly washed clothing often smelled faintly of bonfire grease mixed with chemical burn. A modern detergent commercial would have a hard time selling that fragrance. Archaeological finds confirm that clothing was not just worn, it was reworn until it collapsed. Stitching was repaired again and again, sleeves patched with whatever scraps were available. Your tunic might start life as a respectable garment and end up looking like a quilt stitched together from the corpses of other tunics. And since laundry was rare, lice found in Viking burial clothes proved that your outfit was as much a habitat as it was attire. Keeping your clothes clean was not only about appearances, it was survival. The smoke of the longhouse was not just for cooking, it also functioned as a preservative. The constant exposure to smoke helped keep garments from rotting in the damp Nordic air. Unfortunately, this meant that everything you owned smelled permanently of soot. Your cloak, your shirt, even your hair carried the scent of a half-burned log. Visitors to Viking homes noted that the odour of smoke clung to the people as much as it did the walls. You didn't just smell smoky, you were smoke. There was also a hierarchy to hygiene hidden in clothing. Wealthier Vikings could afford imported fabrics dyed with expensive colours, sometimes even silk stolen from raids or traded from the east. These fabrics showed off status, but they also revealed who could afford to replace lice-ridden linen before it disintegrated. Poorer farmers and labourers had no such luxury. Their clothing was washed in cold streams, beaten against rocks, and worn until it literally fell apart on their bodies. The social divide was visible in the way you smelled as much as in the way you dressed. Laundry itself was an ordeal. Imagine trudging to the river with armfuls of wool, dunking it into freezing water and pounding it against stones while your hands went numb. Soap made from animal fat and ash stung your fingers, left burns, and sometimes corroded the fabric itself. After hours of this, your clothes were technically cleaner, but they now carried the aroma of rancid fat mixed with ash. Drying was just as bad, because the damp Nordic climate rarely gave you a sunny day. Clothes hung inside the longhouse, absorbing even more smoke as they dried. You wore them again, not so much fresh as reseasoned. The stench was inescapable. Travellers from other parts of Europe often remarked on Viking odours, even when they admired their grooming habits. Bathing once a week might keep your face and hair presentable, but your wool tunic held onto 1,000 meals and countless smoky nights. To make matters worse, fleas and lice did not politely stay in your bedding. They crawled into your clothing and nested there, biting you all day long. This is why combs were found buried with Vikings, not just for their hair but for their clothes. Picking lice out of your garments was a daily activity, one that bonded communities in shared misery. What makes this even stranger is that cleanliness, by their standards, was a point of pride. Archaeologists have found tweezers, ear spoons and razors among Viking grave goods, proof that they valued appearance. Yet the same people who plucked their eyebrows and shaved their beards also wore tunics so stiff with grease they could stand on their own. It was a paradox of Viking life, a culture both obsessed with grooming and indifferent to the stink that clung to everything. Clothing also doubled as blankets, making hygiene even worse. At night you wrapped yourself in the same garments you had sweated in all day. Washing bedding was nearly impossible, so your cloak collected not only smoke and sweat, but the drool and dirt of sleep. Over time, layers of filth turned your clothing into a stiff, crusted armour of daily life. When you woke up and put it back on, you were rejoining an ongoing project rather than starting fresh. The role of clothing in Viking hygiene reveals just how different survival was in their world. You did not dress for style, you dressed to withstand weather, to signal your social rank, and to make it through another day without freezing. Hygiene was a distant secondary concern, sacrificed to practicality. Yet in comparison to medieval peasants elsewhere, you looked practically refined. Vikings brushed their hair, trimmed their nails, and sometimes even changed their clothes before attending important gatherings. To their enemies, this level of effort looked extravagant. To us, it looks like the bare minimum. Even with all these rituals, there was no escaping the creeping odour of Viking life. Every stitch of fabric was a reminder that in a world without proper sanitation, your body and your clothing were permanent enemies. You might comb your hair until it gleamed with butter, but your tunic told the real story. It smelled like rot, smoke, and sweat woven together into a tapestry of discomfort. And as you tug your greasy wool cloak tighter against the morning chill, the reality sinks in. Cleanliness was always a compromise, and never a victory. Because even when your hair was slicked, your beard trimmed, and your nails scraped free of dirt, your clothes betrayed you with every breath. Which brings you to the final piece of Viking hygiene that few people today would envy. Not the baths, not the toilets, not the clothing. It was the battle with vermin, the crawling armies of lice and fleas that followed you everywhere, and turned even the smallest act of grooming into a war you could never quite win. You tug your cloak tighter, but no amount of wool can protect you from the tiny invaders that live closer to you than your own kin. Viking hygiene was not just about baths and combs. It was about enduring a constant war against lice, fleas, and other unwanted passengers. Your body was less a person, and more a battlefield, and the enemy never slept. Archaeologists have found lice combs buried with Vikings in astonishing numbers, some carved so finely out of bone or antler that they looked more like prized jewellery than pest control tools. These combs were not accessories, they were survival gear. Viking graves often still contain the microscopic remains of lice, clinging stubbornly to the teeth of the combs. That means even in death, Vikings carried their parasites with them. Imagine being remembered not for your sword or your longship, but for the lice in your beard. Fleas were just as relentless. The straw bedding in longhouses acted like a paradise for them, a warm and humid nest where they could leap endlessly from one host to another. The longhouse itself became a communal petri dish. Smoke from the central fire was meant to drive insects away, but it rarely did more than stun them. You would wake coughing from the smoke only to feel the sharp bite of fleas on your ankles. They did not fear smoke, they thrived in it. Medieval chroniclers even noted the biting vermin of Viking settlements, describing them as inescapable companions. The impact of these parasites was more than irritation. Lice spread trench fever, a disease that caused high fevers, rashes, and endless weakness. Fleas carried intestinal worms, with their eggs found preserved in Viking latrines. Vermin also carried bacteria and viruses that could sweep through communities, and while the great medieval plagues would arrive later, the living conditions of the Viking Age laid the groundwork for epidemics. In short, the bite on your ankle was more than an itch, it was a gamble with disease. The grooming rituals that Vikings became famous for were in large part attempts to manage this infestation. Combs, razors, tweezers, and even tiny spoons for cleaning out ears have been found at burial sites. These were not luxuries, they were weapons in an endless war against vermin. Weekly bathing was less about showing off to neighbours and more about drowning lice before they could multiply further. Your hair slicked with butter was not only a style choice, it also suffocated some of the crawling passengers. Vikings may not have known the exact science, but they understood that greasy hair slowed the infestation down. And it wasn't just people suffering. Livestock shared the same spaces inside longhouses, which meant fleas had plenty of hosts to feed on. Sheep, goats, and humans were equal opportunities for parasites. Your family goat might have been dinner, but it was also a flea hotel. Living together in the smoky gloom meant the cycle of infestation never ended. One louse removed with a comb simply leapt to your neighbour or your pig, waiting patiently to return later. The psychological weight of living with constant vermin is hard to imagine now. Imagine every inch of your skin itching, every seam of your clothing crawling, and no permanent relief in sight. It was part of life, accepted as inevitable, and endured without complaint because everyone suffered together. In sagas and poems, hygiene was mentioned often, but the crawling horrors beneath the surface rarely received words. That silence was its own admission, a cultural agreement that vermin were as natural as rain or snow. The presence of lice and fleas also shaped social life. Combing each other's hair was not just grooming, it was a communal act of pest control. Archaeologists have uncovered seating arrangements in longhouses that suggest families sat close together around the fire, combing through each other's scalps by the dim light. It was bonding, intimacy, and necessity all at once. You were never closer to your kin than when you were fishing lice out of their eyebrows. Even burials reveal this truth. Viking corpses buried with their finest weapons and jewellery still carried lice eggs on their clothing. Fleas were sealed in the soil with them, preserved for centuries as tiny testaments to a life lived in constant irritation. When modern scientists examined these remains, they found that vermin were universal, affecting warriors and farmers alike. No amount of wealth could buy freedom from the itch. The infestations also shaped how Vikings viewed death and the afterlife. In Norse mythology, Valhalla was a hall of feasting and fighting, but rarely do the poems mention lice. Perhaps it was understood that in paradise finally your scalp might be free from the endless crawling. Archaeologists suggest that the tools buried with the dead, like combs and tweezers, symbolized the hope of cleanliness in the afterlife. That even in the Great Hall of Odin, vanity and vermin were intertwined. Your cloak scratches your shoulders as you shift, But the real discomfort comes from the biting swarm at your ankles. You brush at them, but there is no stopping it. Viking hygiene was not about eliminating vermin, it was about living with them. You did not win the war, you simply negotiated a ceasefire each week with a bath, a comb, or a greasy smear of butter in your hair. And as much as outsiders mocked the Vikings, they were still cleaner than most of their medieval contemporaries, which tells you less about Viking standards and more about how low the bar was set. The vermin never leave you, but you adjust, you scratch, you comb, you endure. And as the itch spreads across your body, another problem rises that no comb or bath could ever solve. Because while vermin feasted on your flesh, your mouth held its own horrors. Viking dental hygiene was a story of sharp tools, chewed sticks, and pain that no amount of butter could soften. Your scalp might itch from lice and your cloak might stink of smoke, but all of that fades when the sharp jolt of pain shoots through your jaw. Viking hygiene did not stop at the surface of the skin. The mouth was its own battlefield, filled with chewed sticks, crude tools, and the endless threat of rot. Archaeologists studying Viking skulls often find teeth surprisingly intact, a testament to a diet low in refined sugar. Grains, dried fish, and dairy do not rot enamel the way modern sweets do. But that does not mean Viking mouths were a picture of health. Microscopic analysis shows heavy wear, enamel ground down to the dentin, and cavities caused not by sugar but by grit. Their bread, made from stone-ground flour, contained fragments of actual stone. Every bite sanded down teeth like sandpaper. Imagine chewing your dinner and polishing your molars at the same time. Cavities were not rare and the solutions were brutal. Evidence of primitive dentistry has been found in Viking remains, including drilled teeth. Yes, someone took a sharp tool, likely heated and hammered, and scraped into a rotten tooth. No anaesthetic, no numbing gel, just iron against enamel and pain that could make even a hardened raider weep. There are signs of fillings too, with holes packed using resin or tar. Picture sealing your cavity with the same sticky substance used to waterproof a ship. Every breath and bite carried the taste of pine pitch. Chewing sticks were the closest thing to toothbrushes. Vikings would strip twigs from birch or hazel, chew the ends into frayed bristles, and rub them across their teeth. The method worked to scrape off surface debris, and scientists have found striations in teeth that prove it. These marks show that even without paste or polish, they made the effort to keep their mouths somewhat clean. But while it helped, it did not prevent infection. Once rot set in, pain was inevitable. Abscesses swelled, gums receded, and jaws carried the scars of inflammation that lasted until death. Bad breath was unavoidable. Without modern toothpaste, the smell of decay lingered on every exhale. Combined with a diet heavy in onions, garlic, and fish, the Viking kiss was less romance and more endurance test. Chroniclers in medieval England remarked on Viking grooming habits, but rarely mentioned their breath. Perhaps they chose politeness over honesty, or perhaps the smell of rot was so common in the Middle Ages that no one noticed. The teeth also carried cultural weight. Archaeologists have found Viking skulls with horizontal grooves deliberately filed into the front teeth. This was not accidental wear but intentional body modification. Warriors may have decorated their teeth with dye rubbed into the grooves, creating a fearsome grin. Imagine facing a raider in battle, his smile streaked with red lines, each tooth carved like a warning. It was hygiene, intimidation, and vanity colliding in the strangest way. The pain of Viking dentistry was not only physical, it shaped social life. A toothache could cripple you, making chewing impossible in a culture where every meal was tough, dry, or salted. Malnutrition followed dental pain, as people avoided food that hurt too much to chew. Infection could spread from the mouth into the blood, killing slowly and miserably. Modern medicine understands this connection, but Viking life simply endured it. You lived with the pain until it either faded or ended you. Yet there was still pride in appearance. Vikings valued combs and grooming kits, and teeth were part of that pride. Clean teeth, even if filed, showed status. A warrior with carved teeth announced both his bravery and his wealth. Filing was not something done by accident. It required tools, time, and the ability to endure pain as part of identity. In this way, dental hygiene was more than survival. It was social currency. Picture yourself sitting in the smoky longhouse, your jaw aching, a stick between your teeth as you try to scrub away the taste of last night's fish. Around you, others chew on twigs, spit fragments into the fire, and wince with each bite. The sound of grinding wood and cracking teeth fills the air, a nightly chorus of survival. A nearby elder groans, clutching his jaw, his swollen cheek proof that no comb or bath could save him. You understand that Viking hygiene was not only a matter of filth and lice, but of constant pain. The archaeological record makes it clear. Viking mouths carried the legacy of their lives: grit from bread, grooves carved for intimidation, abscess scars marking silent agony. Each tooth tells the story of survival in a world without dentists, where the only cure was endurance. Cleanliness was relative, but pain was universal. And as your jaw throbs and your stomach churns, you realize hygiene stretched far beyond body and mouth. Even the air you breathed carried its own hidden dangers. Because while you might bathe, comb, and scrub your teeth, every lungful of smoke in the longhouse left its own stain. The Viking battle against filth was not only against lice and cavities, it was against the very walls that trapped you. The ache in your jaw fades only when the sting in your lungs takes over. Breathing in a Viking longhouse was not refreshing, it was survival by suffocation. The hearth burned in the centre of the packed dirt floor, and above it there was no chimney. The smoke had nowhere to go except straight into your eyes, your nose, and your chest. Every breath was a slow seasoning of your lungs with soot. Archaeologists studying the remains of Viking settlements have found that the timbers of longhouses are blackened with centuries of smoke. Soot still coats the rafters, proof that fire smouldered endlessly day and night. The fire was never allowed to die out. It provided light, heat, and the ability to cook food, but it also created a choking fog that filled every crevice. Your clothes absorbed it, your hair reeked of it, and your lungs became black archives of smoke. The health consequences were severe. In modern medical terms, the constant inhalation of smoke would lead to chronic respiratory problems, asthma-like wheezing, and even early death. Skeletal remains of Vikings show signs of rib lesions, evidence of long-term lung infections. Imagine being 25 years old and already carrying the lungs of an elderly coal miner. That was the cost of breathing indoors. Yet the smoke was also considered useful. It helped preserve meat hung from the rafters, keeping fish and pork edible longer in the damp climate. It drove away insects, at least in theory, though the fleas in your bedding clearly did not get the message. The smoke also dried the timber of the house, preventing rot in walls and roofs. For all its dangers, smoke was part of the architecture of Viking survival. You endured the coughing fits because the alternative was hunger and decay. The sensory assault was constant. Your eyes watered, leaving streaks of soot across your cheeks. Tears mingled with the grease on your skin, forming grimy tracks that stained your face. Every blink scraped ash across your eyeballs. The smell clung to you so thoroughly that you could walk into the open air and still reek like a fireplace. Outsiders noted this too. Medieval chroniclers often described the smoky odour of Norsemen, a scent so strong it lingered in the imagination as much as their raids. Sleeping in the smoke was its own misery. Longhouses were crowded with dozens of bodies lying on straw mats around the central fire. As the flames smouldered, smoke sank low, hugging the floor. You inhaled it through the night, dreaming of battles while your lungs waged their own. Children, elders, and livestock all shared the same air. Sheep bleated, pigs grunted, and everyone coughed together in the darkness. It was not just a home, it was a collective smokehouse where the people themselves were slowly cured. Firewood scarcity added another layer of grime. Vikings often burned peat, a dense, mossy fuel dug from the earth. When dried, Peat smoulders thickly, producing not just smoke but a greasy, choking haze. The smell was stronger than wood and lingered in the air for hours. Peat smoke coated walls with resinous layers that still cling to archaeological remains today. To live in a Viking longhouse was to breathe the ground itself, transformed into smoke that ate away at your chest. The psychological side of smoke was also important. It was believed to cleanse the space, to keep away evil spirits, and to sanctify the home. Ritual fires were part of Norse religion, and even the daily hearth carried spiritual meaning. Smoke was not just filth, it was a force, both protective and destructive. You might cough until your ribs ached, but you also believed the smoke protected you from unseen dangers. The irony is that compared to many medieval Europeans, Vikings were still ahead in matters of hygiene. Weekly bathing, grooming tools and combs gave them an edge, but their longhouses betrayed them. Clean hair and scrubbed faces meant little when your lungs were being slowly blackened. Hygiene ended at the threshold of the mouth and nose, where the invisible filth of the longhouse finished what the lice and fleas began. Even their architecture worked against them. Longhouses were built with turf walls, thick and insulating, but they trapped heat and smoke alike. Without chimneys, ventilation was minimal. Small smoke holes sometimes existed, but they were often closed to keep out rain and wind. The result was a chamber thick with soot, an atmosphere so heavy that stepping outside into the icy northern air felt like relief. Fresh air was not a luxury, it was a medicine. As you sit near the fire, eyes watering and chest tightening, you realise that every breath is a choice. Freeze in the cold night air or choke in the warmth of the longhouse. Comfort and suffering were always intertwined. Vikings chose survival, even if it meant a lifetime of coughing, wheezing and gasping for breath. The longhouse itself was a paradox. It preserved food, protected families, and allowed communities to thrive in brutal climates. Yet it also poisoned those same families with every flicker of flame. Archaeologists can still measure the soot layers in soil where longhouses once stood. Centuries later, the evidence of smoke still clings to the earth. Your lungs would not survive long here, but the walls endured. And as the fire pops and the smoke swirls, your lungs fill with another reminder that Viking hygiene was never about being clean in the modern sense. It was about enduring dirt, filth, and smoke long enough to see another day. The coughing subsides only when you step outside into the icy air, your hair stiff with grease, your clothes heavy with soot. For a moment you breathe clearly, but then you remember that even out here, hygiene was its own battle. Because while the longhouse air choked you, the natural world around you provided its own bizarre forms of cleanliness. The rivers, the baths, and the steaming hot springs of the Viking landscape offered both relief and new horrors. The first breath of crisp northern air feels like freedom after the smoke-soaked lungs of the longhouse. And yet this was only part of the Viking struggle with hygiene. The outdoors offered water, and water offered baths, but bathing was never as refreshing as you might hope. In the Viking Age, the pursuit of cleanliness was a ritual of discomfort, gossip, and survival all rolled together. Weekly bathing was the standard, and for much of Europe this was scandalous. Anglo-Saxon chroniclers mocked Norsemen for their vanity, claiming they bathed every Saturday and combed their hair daily. But ridicule was only a mask for jealousy. Compared to peasants who might wash once a year, Vikings looked like walking gods, their hair combed, their faces washed, their nails trimmed. The very idea that hygiene could win hearts and marriages terrified their neighbours. Cleanliness became another weapon in the Viking arsenal, as potent as their axes. Yet, weekly bathing was not a luxury spa. For many it meant breaking ice on a river, stripping off layers of greasy wool, and plunging into water so cold it shocked your lungs into forgetting your own name. Hot springs in Iceland provided natural relief, but these were not widespread. For most Vikings, the bath was either a freezing ordeal or a tepid bucket in a smoky corner. Archaeological finds confirm that wooden tubs were used, sometimes filled with water heated by stones. Entire families would crowd in, one after another, creating what was essentially a communal broth of humanity. Soap was no fragrant bar. Viking soap was made from animal fat mixed with lye, a caustic substance derived from wood ash. It was effective at stripping dirt, but it also stripped skin, leaving your hands raw and your hair brittle. Hair treated with lye soap often turned lighter, giving rise to the stereotype of blonde Viking warriors. In truth, some were naturally blonde, but others chemically bleached their hair by repeatedly washing it with harsh soap. It was fashion through chemical burns, vanity at the cost of a tender scalp. Bathing also carried a social element. In settlements, bathhouses existed where people gathered not only to wash, but to talk, trade, and gossip. Bathing was never entirely private. Men and women often bathed separately, though sources differ on whether mixed bathing sometimes occurred. Either way, the act of bathing placed you in the public eye, your cleanliness on display for all to judge. A dirty Viking could not hide behind excuses. Grease and grime were visible, and neighbours remembered. The Norse sagas reveal how important this was. Characters were often described as well-groomed or dirty as a marker of their moral state. Cleanliness equated to honour, filth to disgrace. Even warriors preparing for battle sometimes bathed beforehand, as if death demanded a presentable face. To stride into Valhalla with greasy hair would have been unthinkable. Archaeological evidence supports this obsession, with combs, razors and soapstones found in burial sites. Even in death, grooming mattered. But for all this effort, bathing had limits. Rivers could carry waste from latrines, turning your morning wash into a plunge into diluted sewage. Communal tubs quickly grew rancid after multiple uses, and the use of animal fat soap left you smelling faintly like a smoked pig even when technically clean. Hygiene was relative. To a medieval Englishman, the Viking fresh from the river looked dazzling. To modern eyes, he looked like someone who bathed once a week in swamp water and considered it a victory. The irony is that this weekly ritual set Vikings apart in ways they never intended. Their enemies spread rumours that their cleanliness was trickery, a way to seduce foreign women. The Chronicon Ethelwerdi, an English chronicle, mentions that Norsemen bathed and combed their hair so often that English women preferred them to their own husbands. Imagine being an English farmer who bathes once in midsummer, suddenly losing your wife to a man who smells only slightly of goat. Hygiene became politics, a battlefield of soap and water. Bathing was also tied to the rhythm of the week. Saturday, known as Lugadagur in Old Norse, literally meant washing day. This naming shows how integral bathing was to Viking life. Every week the cycle of filth and cleansing repeated, and every week families endured the shock of icy rivers or the scald of lye soap. Cleanliness was not indulgence, it was expectation, woven into language itself. The reality of bathing reveals another contradiction in Viking hygiene. They were meticulous about hair and skin, yet careless about parasites and filth in clothing. They valued the public image of cleanliness, yet lived in smoky, insect-infested homes. This paradox baffled outsiders. To the English monk writing bitterly about Norse grooming, it was as if the invaders had weaponized soap. But for the Vikings, bathing was simply part of life, part of the weekly cycle of survival, honour and discomfort. You lower yourself into the icy river, your skin burning with cold, your breath stolen away. Around you others do the same, gasping, scrubbing with lye soap, scraping dirt with combs. The air is filled with the sound of chattering teeth and nervous laughter. And as you surface shivering, hair plastered to your head with grease and soap, you realise this is as clean as you will ever be. Not fresh, not fragrant, but presentable enough to win honour and perhaps charm someone in the market before the lice return. The bath ends, the week begins again, and the cycle of filth resumes. Yet there was one part of Viking hygiene that carried its own rituals and superstitions, a part so small and often ignored that it hides in plain sight. Not the bath, not the smoke, not even the lice. It was the care of the ears and nose, tiny details of grooming that revealed just how seriously Vikings took the act of scraping filth from their bodies. Your body may never feel truly clean, your hair may always be greasy with butter, and your tunic may forever smell like a damp campfire. But even in that world of filth, the smallest details mattered. Viking hygiene was not just about the grand rituals of bathing, or the grim realities of lice. It also came down to the little tools, the miniature weapons carried on belts and hidden in pouches, ready to scrape, pluck and dig at the tiniest imperfections. Archaeologists digging through Viking graves are often surprised not just by the swords and shields, but by grooming kits. Hanging from a belt, a warrior might carry tweezers, a nail cleaner, and an ear spoon. These were not luxuries reserved for the wealthy. Even humble graves contained them, suggesting that grooming was not optional. It was a cultural expectation, as vital to identity as your axe or your cloak. The ear spoon is the most famous of these tools. A small bronze or iron scoop attached to a ring or chain, it was used to clean out earwax. Tiny, precise and portable, it was the medieval version of a cotton swab. Wax was more than an inconvenience. In an age of constant noise, wind and infection, keeping the ears clear mattered. It prevented build-up that could affect hearing, which was essential for following orders, listening to sagas, or reacting to sudden threats on the battlefield. A blocked ear was more than uncomfortable, it was a vulnerability. The spoons also carried social meaning. To pull one out in public and clean your ear showed diligence, even pride. Imagine a warrior polishing his axe with one hand and casually scraping his ear with the other. Hygiene was part of status, and earwax was the enemy. Some spoons were decorated, engraved with intricate designs, proof that even the act of cleaning one's ear could be elevated to an art. Tweezers were equally common. Viking grooming was obsessed with hair, not just on the head but on the face, the eyebrows, even the nose. Stray hairs were plucked, eyebrows trimmed, and facial lines maintained with meticulous care. Archaeological finds of tweezers are so widespread that historians conclude they were nearly universal. To neglect your eyebrows was to invite ridicule, and in a culture where insult could start a blood feud, appearances were dangerous business. Nail cleaners were another staple. Long nails were a sign of filth and laziness, while trimmed nails showed control and discipline. In sagas, insults often revolved around accusations of being dirty or unkempt. To mock someone's grooming was to question their honour. A man with dirty nails was a man unworthy of respect. Viking hygiene, then, was not just practical, it was political. Each scrape of the nail cleaner was a defence of reputation. These tools also reveal the portability of hygiene. Long voyages and raids meant weeks at sea in cramped, stinking ships. You could not bring a bath, but you could bring tweezers. The small grooming kits ensured that even in the filth of travel, you could maintain the appearance of control. When Vikings arrived on foreign shores, their hair combed and their nails trimmed, they appeared terrifyingly polished compared to the local peasants. Chroniclers described them as too well groomed, almost unnervingly clean, as if vanity itself was a weapon. The cultural obsession with grooming even extended into law. In Icelandic sagas, disputes sometimes erupted over insults related to filth. To call a man unwashed or dirty was to provoke a challenge. This shows how deeply hygiene was woven into identity. Your comb, your ear spoon, your tweezers, these were not personal items, they were symbols of honour. A warrior without them was incomplete. Even burial practices reflect this. Many graves include grooming kits placed alongside weapons, as if the dead needed to maintain appearances in the afterlife. The presence of these tools suggests that the battle for cleanliness never ended, not even in Valhalla. To face the gods, you needed to be presentable, your ears scraped, your nails clean, your hair combed. Death did not excuse filth. The tools themselves were often crafted with surprising beauty. Bronze ear spoons with elegant handles, tweezers engraved with patterns, and nail cleaners shaped with care. These were not disposable items, they were personal treasures, passed down, repaired, and carried every day. Their survival in the archaeological record speaks to how important they were. A Viking might lose his cloak or his axe, but his grooming kit was always within reach. Imagine sitting by the river after a bath, shivering from the cold, your hair stiff with lye soap. You pull out a tiny bronze spoon and scrape your ear, careful not to miss a spot. Around you, others do the same, plucking, scraping, combing. It is a communal performance, each small act reinforcing the cultural standard. Cleanliness was never absolute, but it was always pursued, down to the smallest crevice of the body. The irony is that even with these tools, filth was unavoidable. Your ear might be free of wax, but your lungs were still black with smoke. Your nails might be clean, but your tunic was crawling with lice. Grooming was less about eradicating filth, and more about controlling its image. A Viking could never be truly clean, but he could look like he tried. And in a society where appearance carried weight, that effort was everything. These tiny instruments tell a larger story about Viking hygiene. They reveal a culture that valued order in the midst of chaos, appearance in the midst of filth. To wield an ear spoon was to declare war on dirt, to hold back the tide of decay with a scrap of bronze. It was a battle that could never be won, but it was fought with determination nonetheless. And as you tuck your grooming kit back into your belt, you realise that the Viking fight against filth extended beyond body and clothing. Even their food carried its own hygiene challenges. The diet that kept them alive also carried hidden dangers, smells and filth that shaped daily life. To eat like a Viking was to invite another layer of discomfort, one that no ear spoon could ever clean away. The grooming kit slips back into your belt, your ears scraped clean, your nails trimmed, your eyebrows plucked into some semblance of order. For a moment you feel accomplished, until the smell of food hits you and reminds you that cleanliness ends where the table begins. Viking hygiene was not only about combs, baths and smoke. It extended, or rather collapsed, into the realm of eating, where filth was not avoided but swallowed whole. The longhouse fire that choked your lungs also served as the kitchen. Meat, fish, and porridge simmered in soot-blackened pots that were never truly scrubbed. Archaeological evidence shows cooking vessels thick with layers of charred residue, each layer sealing in the ghost of 100 meals. Cleaning them meant scraping with twigs or wiping with rags that had seen better centuries. Soap was rarely wasted on pots. Instead, grease built up until the pot itself smelled like an ancient stew. You did not taste just the meal in front of you, you tasted history, whether you wanted to or not. The food itself carried its own hygiene horrors. Meat was often salted or smoked to preserve it, but even preservation had limits. Spoiled food was eaten because hunger did not care about flavour. Fermented fish, a dish still known in Scandinavia today, was created less as a delicacy and more as desperation. Fish buried and left to rot in the ground would ferment, producing a stench so powerful it clung to your hair and skin long after you swallowed it. To eat was to carry the smell with you, a permanent seasoning of your breath and clothing. Milk and dairy were staples of the Viking diet, but hygiene was not a priority in their production. Raw milk, often stored in wooden containers, soured quickly. Butter and cheese were made, but cleanliness was relative. Butter was as likely to be crawling with bacteria as it was to be spread on bread. And remember, some of that butter ended up in hair as grooming gel, which meant the same dairy product that slicked your scalp also coated your bread. The line between food and hygiene product was thin and sometimes non-existent. Communal eating made matters worse. Families and guests ate from shared bowls, dipping wooden spoons or fingers into the same mixture of porridge or stew. Imagine dozens of hands, nails recently scraped but still crawling with lice, plunging into the same pot. Germ theory did not exist, but illness thrived. Archaeological studies of Viking skeletons show signs of chronic intestinal parasites spread through contaminated food and water. Roundworms and whipworms were common dinner guests, silently transferred from hand to mouth to stomach in every meal. Cutlery was minimal, spoons existed, Knives were essential, but forks were almost unknown. Most food was eaten with fingers, greasy hands wiping on wool tunics already stiff with soot. Bread served as a plate, absorbing juices and oils before being eaten too. Your clothes were napkin, towel, and table all at once. No wonder garments reeked of centuries of meals. Even the act of eating was another step in the layering of filth upon your body. The smells of Viking meals permeated every corner of life. The longhouse itself smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage, dried fish, and smoke. Outsiders remarked on the odour of Norse settlements, where food, animals, and people blended into one overwhelming stench. To modern noses it would have been suffocating, but to Vikings it was the smell of survival. Hunger made every odour tolerable, every flavour edible. Cleanliness was a luxury compared to a full belly. Despite the filth, there was pride in hospitality. Offering food and drink to guests was a point of honour, even if the stew smelled like wet boots and the ale was sour with bacteria. Norse sagas described lavish feasts, but archaeology shows the reality. Bones gnawed bare, fish heads discarded, porridge scorched to the bottom of pots. Guests might admire the generosity, but they could not ignore the smell. Feasting was less about refinement and more about endurance. The hygiene of drink was no better. Ale was common, safer than water in many cases, but brewing conditions were far from sterile. Wooden vats, reused endlessly, harboured bacteria. Sometimes the ale turned sour, sometimes it caused sickness. Water itself was often drawn from streams contaminated by latrines upstream. To drink was to gamble, and the gamble rarely paid off cleanly. Even mead, the prized honey drink of the Vikings, was brewed in conditions that would make a modern brewer weep. Sweetness masked rot, and intoxication blurred the memory of taste. Food storage also shaped hygiene. In winter, meat and fish were hung in smoky rafters to preserve them. This meant your home smelled perpetually of drying carcasses, the air filled with the grease of pork and the tang of fish. Smoke preserved, but it also coated, leaving every meal with a taste of soot. The same smoke that made you cough also flavoured your food. You were never just eating meat, you were eating firewood. Even rituals of dining reflected the battle with filth. Washing before meals did exist, though not with soap and water as we know it. Hands might be rinsed in a communal bowl, the same water passed around from person to person. By the time it reached you, the bowl was less cleanser than soup, floating with dirt, grease, and maybe a stray hair. Yet to refuse the ritual was an insult, so you dipped your hands, pretended to feel cleaner, and then ate anyway. The relationship between food and hygiene shaped Viking reputation abroad. Foreigners described them as simultaneously clean and foul, their hair combed but their breath rank, their nails trimmed but their clothing reeking of fish. This paradox confused their enemies. How could a people so concerned with combs tolerate such filth in their food? The answer was necessity. You could scrape your earwax with a bronze spoon, but you could not refuse the fish that kept you alive through winter. Hygiene had limits, and food always pushed past them. As you finish your bowl of porridge, thick with smoke and crawling with invisible parasites, you lick your fingers and wipe them on your wool cloak. The meal sits heavy in your stomach, but it also clings to your skin and clothes. Cleanliness evaporates with every bite, and the battle begins again. Viking hygiene was not a standard of freshness. It was a cycle of endless compromise, where survival came before comfort and filth came with every spoonful. The meal ends, the pots are pushed aside, the longhouse settles back into its smoky rhythm. But hygiene does not pause after eating. It continues in the ways you groom your hair, your beard, and the rest of your body. For the Vikings, hair was more than fashion. It was identity, honour and hygiene all braided into one, carrying its own rituals and absurdities that shaped how they were seen in life and in legend. The last traces of fish cling to your breath, but what others notice first is your hair. Viking hygiene revolved as much around appearance as it did survival, and hair was at the centre of it all. It was not just something to grow and ignore, It was cultivated, trimmed, bleached, greased, and styled into shapes that terrified enemies and impressed neighbours. In the Viking Age, your hair was both your crown and your battlefield. Combs were found in nearly every Viking grave, more common than weapons, proving their importance. They were made from antler, bone, and wood, sometimes decorated with intricate carvings. To own a comb was not vanity, it was necessity. You combed daily, not only to look presentable but to scrape out lice, dandruff, and the grease of butter rubbed into your scalp. The comb was both a cosmetic tool and a survival kit, the barrier between you and endless infestation. Hair was carefully styled, often cut short in the back and left long in the front or on top, a style noted by chroniclers in England who thought it unnerving. To see a group of warriors with sharp haircuts, gleaming faces and trimmed beards was to see discipline in physical form. Where many medieval peasants wore hair like a mat of dirt and straw, Vikings cut and shaped theirs to stand out. It was a visual declaration of difference, of superiority, of being something more than ordinary men. Bleaching hair was another ritual. Lye soap made from animal fat and ash lightened hair over time, turning it blonde or reddish. Natural blondes became brighter, brunettes sometimes shifted toward ginger, and the overall effect was an army of sun-haired warriors that terrified enemies who believed them touched by the gods. The chemical burn that came with it was ignored. A stinging scalp was worth the image of divine radiance. Archaeological traces of this bleaching practice confirm that it was not rare but widespread, showing that appearance mattered deeply in Norse society. Beards carried their own weight in hygiene and identity. Long, unkempt beards were associated with laziness, while trimmed, shaped beards reflected discipline and honour. Razors were found among grooming kits, used to shave cheeks, necks, or even entire faces. Some Vikings wore moustaches, others clean-shaven chins, but all followed a clear cultural expectation. The sagas describe insults focused on grooming, calling a man beardless as a way to attack his masculinity. To lack facial hair was shameful unless you compensated with precise grooming. Your beard was more than hair, it was status. Archaeological finds show that grooming extended into funerary practices. Men were buried with razors and combs, women with shears and pins, suggesting that hair was too important to neglect in death. In Valhalla, you would need to look your best. Warriors did not stride into the hall of the gods covered in lice and grease. They entered combed, trimmed, and ready for battle. The burial goods proved that even the afterlife demanded grooming. The grease itself was its own absurdity. Butter and animal fat slicked hair into place, functioning as primitive gel. The effect was striking, but the smell was overwhelming. Hair stiff with fat reeked of goat and smoke, the odour clinging to anyone near you. Yet to Vikings this was a mark of care, of deliberate styling. Outsiders may have gagged, but among Norsemen it was a sign of pride. To let your hair flop ungreased was to admit defeat to the elements. Hairstyles also communicated identity and intimidation. Some warriors shaved one side of the head, leaving the other long and braided, creating an asymmetrical appearance that unsettled enemies. To march into battle with hair gleaming with grease, half your head shorn, and your beard carved into sharp lines, was to weaponize your own body. You did not just fight with an axe, you fought with your image. The cultural importance of hair extended to women as well. Women's hair was often worn long, braided, and carefully maintained, with pins, beads, and combs as common grave goods. Clean, well-styled hair symbolized honor and good standing in the community. Dirty, unkempt hair was an insult, used in sagas to mark characters as villains or outsiders. Even in a world of filth, hair had to be managed. But the reality beneath the styling was always the same. Grease collected in strands, lice returned no matter how many times you combed, and the smell of animal fat clung to your pillow and cloak. Beauty was achieved through discomfort, and hygiene was a performance more than a reality. You might look fierce with your bleached hair and sculpted beard, but you still smelled like smoke and goat. The irony is that this obsession with grooming was precisely what set the Vikings apart in Europe. Chroniclers could not reconcile the paradox. How could men so filthy in their homes appear so clean in public? The answer was effort. Daily combing, weekly bathing, bleaching, greasing and trimming created a facade of refinement that outsiders mistook for natural beauty. In truth, it was work. Endless labour against a tide of filth that never retreated. Imagine sitting by the smoky fire, your beard trimmed sharp, your hair slick with butter, your comb tucked neatly in your belt. Around you, others perform the same rituals, each strand shaped, each eyebrow plucked. It is communal grooming, an endless war waged with small tools and animal fat. You're never truly clean, but you're always fighting to appear so. That was Viking hygiene. It was less about defeating dirt and more about outshining those who surrendered to it. And as the longhouse fills again with the sound of combs scraping through greasy locks, you realise hygiene was not only about the living. Death itself carried its own rituals of cleanliness. Bodies had to be washed, hair combed and nails trimmed before burial, for even the dead were expected to be presentable. Viking hygiene did not end with life. It stretched into the afterlife, demanding order in the face of decay. The greasy comb slips back into your belt, your beard freshly trimmed, and your scalp itching from the lye soap still burning faintly at the roots. For a moment you look presentable, almost respectable. But then the thought creeps in, a reminder that no amount of combing or bathing could hide you forever. Eventually every Viking faced the last ritual of hygiene, the cleansing of the body for burial. Death did not end grooming, it only made it more elaborate. Archaeological evidence shows that bodies in the Viking Age were washed, dressed and often groomed before burial. Even in decay, hair was combed, nails were trimmed, and clothes were chosen with care. Sagas describe funerary preparations in detail, where relatives carefully washed the corpse, laid out fine garments, and arranged grooming tools alongside weapons. To enter the afterlife unkempt was an insult to both the gods and the family. Cleanliness was expected in death even when it was rarely achieved in life. Burial sites across Scandinavia reveal this obsession. Graves often contained combs, tweezers, razors, and ear spoons, placed as grave goods to accompany the dead into the next world. Warriors were buried with their grooming kits, women with shears and pins, showing that hygiene crossed gender and status. These items were not luxuries added at the last moment. They were essentials, as important to the soul as the weapons and jewellery laid at the body's side. The gods might not care about the smell of your cloak, but they would notice your untrimmed beard. The funeral pyre carried its own strange hygiene. Burning a body was not only a ritual, it was a cleansing act. Fire stripped away filth, parasites, and decay, leaving ash to rise toward the heavens. The smell, however, was unforgettable. Imagine a pyre of wood, animal offerings, and a human body burning together, smoke curling into the sky while the community stood watching. The air filled with a scent of charred flesh and singed hair, a stench so heavy it clung to clothing and memory alike. Cleanliness by fire came at the price of suffocating odour. Not every Viking was cremated. Many were buried, and their bodies show the marks of grooming even in death. Archaeologists have uncovered skulls with filed teeth, suggesting warriors were buried with their battle-ready appearances intact. Hair preserved in some graves shows signs of braiding and combing. Even when decay had already begun, families made the effort to present the body as whole, clean, and honourable. Hygiene was ritual, and ritual was survival beyond life. These practices reveal how deeply hygiene tied into Viking beliefs. The afterlife demanded order. Whether it was Valhalla, Folkvanga, or Hell, the dead carried their identity with them, and identity meant being groomed. The tools buried alongside them symbolised the fight against filth, the eternal struggle to appear clean in a world where filth was constant. The gods might grant honour, but humans were expected to provide the combs. Death rituals also reinforced the community's own survival. Washing a corpse was both symbolic and practical. It reduced the smell, at least temporarily, and allowed families to gather without gagging. Burial clothes were carefully chosen, sometimes the finest garments a person had ever worn. These clothes too carried the sense of smoke and grease, but they were presentable, stitched together with pride. Even the lice clinging to seams were buried as silent witnesses, preserved for archaeologists centuries later. The act of burial extended hygiene beyond the body. The grave itself was ordered, layered with goods and symbols that spoke to identity. Weapons and jewellery may have been status, but combs and razors were humanity. No one was too poor for grooming. Even the simplest graves contained evidence of hygiene tools, proof that dignity was bound to cleanliness. To die dirty was to die dishonoured. In sagas, insults often revolved around filth. To call a man unwashed, lice-ridden or greasy was to strip him of respect. Funerary rituals reversed this insult, ensuring that no one entered death with such shame. The dead were defended with combs and soapstones, with hairpins and tweezers, as though honour could be brushed into place one last time. Archaeologists studying these graves remark on the sheer frequency of grooming items more than almost any other personal possession. The Viking afterlife was combed and polished, even if the living world never truly was. Yet even in death, filth persisted. Parasite eggs have been found in Viking burials, clinging to soil and clothing centuries after the body decayed. Worms and lice followed people into the grave, buried companions of a lifetime of infestation. The struggle for cleanliness never truly ended. Fire might burn away the body, but burial preserved the truth. Hygiene was a story of effort, never victory. Picture the scene. A body laid out on a wooden platform, hair braided neatly, beard trimmed, nails cleaned. Relatives place a comb at the belt, a razor at the hand, and a fine cloak over the chest. Smoke from the pyre rises, or soil covers the corpse, and the ritual is complete. The body may have coughed through life, scratched through infestations, and stank of buttered hair, but in death it looked ready for an audience with the gods. That was Viking hygiene in its final form, and as the burial mound closes or the ashes scatter, the living return to their longhouses where smoke fills lungs, lice crawl back into hair, and grease stiffens in cloaks. The cycle of filth continues, but the dead carry their combs into eternity. Hygiene was never about winning against dirt. It was about pretending, performing, and preserving dignity long enough to pass into legend. Yet grooming did not end at hair or burial. The body itself carried rituals beyond bathing and combing. The care of nails, the scraping of skin, the shaving of faces, even the plucking of eyebrows all reveal the strange intimacy of Viking hygiene. These rituals, small but obsessive, show how deeply appearance mattered in a culture surrounded by smoke, lice, and filth. The burial mound closes, the comb is tucked into the earth, and the dead are left with their honour intact. But the living do not escape so easily. Each day, the body itself became another battlefield in the endless war against filth. Nails, skin, and every inch of exposed surface demanded attention, because even the smallest detail of hygiene could betray you. Nails were a particular obsession. Viking graves often contained nail cleaners, slender bronze or iron tools with hooked ends designed to scrape dirt from beneath the fingernails. To neglect this detail was more than laziness. It was shame. Sagas record insults where enemies mocked each other for filth, calling out blackened nails as proof of dishonour. Clean hands showed control, while dirty nails branded you a slob unfit for respect. Imagine being judged not for your sword, but for the grime under your thumb. In Viking society, that was enough to spark ridicule or even violence. The tools themselves reveal how seriously this was taken. Archaeologists have uncovered grooming kits with nail cleaners worn smooth from constant use. These tools were carried alongside razors and tweezers, small but essential. They suggest a culture that placed hygiene not as vanity, but as a marker of status. Clean nails were a public display of dignity, visible in handshakes, oaths, and feasts. Dirt under your nails was dirt on your honour. Skin was equally policed. Daily life in a smoky longhouse coated skin with soot and grease, leaving pores clogged with filth. Washing weekly helped, but between baths, Vikings used scraping tools similar to strigils found in the Roman world. These metal scrapers pulled sweat, grease and dirt from the skin, a crude but effective way to feel cleaner. The practice may have been learned through contact with southern cultures, showing how far hygiene ideas travelled through trade and raids. To scrape your skin until it reddened was to scrape away shame as much as filth. Soap added another layer of discomfort. Made from animal fat and lye, it was caustic, stinging cuts and leaving the skin raw. Yet it was valued, even exported. Viking soapstones, small containers used for making and storing soap, have been found across Scandinavia. Soap was part of their identity, a symbol of difference from other Europeans who rarely washed. But using it meant enduring the burn, a sacrifice made for the sake of appearing clean. The obsession with outward appearance extended to public gatherings. At feasts, clean nails and scrubbed skin mattered as much as polished weapons. Guests judged each other not only by the size of their rings, but by the cleanliness of their hands. Archaeological remains of feasting halls contain not just drinking horns and bones, but grooming tools, suggesting that appearance was part of hospitality. You combed, plucked, and scraped before stepping into the hall, because filth was a silent insult to your host. Children too were subject to this regime. Viking burials of young individuals include grooming items, showing that hygiene was taught early. A child's comb or nail cleaner buried in a grave reveals that grooming was not an adult luxury but a lifelong expectation. From the moment you could hold a comb, you were trained to fight the endless war against dirt. The irony was that while nails and skin were carefully maintained, lice, fleas, and parasites still thrived. Clean fingernails did not protect you from the worm eggs in your food or the smoke in your lungs, but appearances mattered more than reality. Vikings did not need to be free of filth. They only needed to look like they fought against it. Cleanliness was performance, a display of willpower in a world that resisted it at every turn. The cultural weight of hygiene tools even influenced burial customs. Grave goods often included nail cleaners and scrapers, suggesting that the dead needed to present themselves to the gods as clean. A warrior's honour was judged not only by his blade but by his fingernails. To enter the afterlife dirty would have been an insult. The gods demanded warriors, not slobs. Archaeological patterns confirm this, with grooming kits found in both wealthy and modest graves, showing that hygiene was universal across classes. The practice of scraping skin and nails also reveals the psychological reality of Viking life. Surrounded by filth, the small rituals of grooming gave a sense of control. To scrape dirt from under your nails was to push back against the chaos. To comb your hair was to declare order in a world of lice. Hygiene was not about achieving perfection, it was about proving that you tried. That effort alone separated you from those who surrendered to filth entirely. Imagine sitting by the longhouse fire, smoke curling into your lungs, your cloak heavy with grease. You pull a nail cleaner from your belt, scraping at the grime that has collected through a day of labour. Each curl of dirt flicked away is a small victory. Around you others do the same, scraping, combing, plucking. It is communal, intimate and relentless. You're never clean, but you're always fighting to appear so. That was Viking hygiene. And as your nails gleam faintly in the firelight, your skin raw from scraping, you realise hygiene stretched into every corner of life. Not only body and clothing, not only food and burial. Even the tools of war carried their own hygiene rituals. Weapons and armour demanded cleaning as much as the body, for filth on a blade was dishonour, and a dirty shield was shame. The Viking fight against filth extended from scalp to sword, from fingernails to the edge of an axe. The nail cleaner slips back into your belt. Your skin feels raw from scraping, and your hands are finely presentable. But then your gaze falls on your axe, and you realise that Viking hygiene did not end with the body. Weapons and armour demanded their own ritual of cleanliness. A dirty blade was not just unsightly, it was dishonourable. Filth on a sword could mean weakness, and weakness was unacceptable in a culture where appearance defined respect. Archaeologists have found Viking weapons with traces of oils, evidence that blades were carefully maintained. Iron rusts quickly in damp northern climates, so constant cleaning was essential. Warriors polished axes, swords, and spears with oils made from animal fat, rubbing them until the metal gleamed. The same fat used for hair gel and soap found its way onto steel. A Viking warrior was greased from scalp to sword. The smell of rancid butter may have been overwhelming, but it kept both hair and weapons from falling apart. Shields carried their own hygiene. Made from wood, leather and iron fittings, they were vulnerable to rot and mould in the damp. To preserve them, shields were rubbed with animal fat and occasionally smoke-dried near fires. The result was a shield that smelled like a barn but lasted longer in battle. Archaeological finds of Viking shields show evidence of patching and repair, proof that they were maintained with the same persistence as clothing. A shield was your second skin, and neglecting it was as shameful as neglecting your body. Armour too carried its own rituals. Mail shirts, painstakingly forged from thousands of rings, had to be cleaned constantly to prevent rust. Historians believe sand and vinegar were used to scrub away grime, poured into a barrel with the armour and shaken until the rings gleamed again. Imagine spending hours shaking a barrel of sand and metal, listening to the clang as you fought a war not against enemies but against corrosion. To wear rusty armour was to announce your laziness to everyone watching. Vikings endured the noise and effort because appearance mattered even on the battlefield. The irony was that these cleaning rituals made combat even filthier. Oiled weapons dripped grease, coating hands and clothing. Mail shirts carried the smell of vinegar and sweat. Shields absorbed the odour of animal fat. A line of Viking warriors ready for battle may have looked intimidating, but they smelled like a slaughterhouse mixed with a brewery. Yet to their enemies, the shine of polished blades and gleaming armour outweighed the stench. Hygiene was never about fragrance, it was about optics. Weapons were also tied to ritual cleaning after battle. Blood once spilled had to be scrubbed from blades immediately to prevent rust. Animal fat and water were used, sometimes sand to scour the surface. Failing to clean a blade after battle risked corrosion, a sign of dishonour. Archaeological evidence of weapons with smooth, well-preserved edges shows how seriously this was taken. A warrior could die with his body filthy, but his weapon was expected to remain immaculate. Even helmets, rare though they were, carried hygiene rituals. Leather linings had to be replaced as sweat and grease rotted them. Metal domes were polished with fat or ash to keep them from pitting. The famous Viking helmet with horns is a myth, but the real helmets, plain and functional, still required constant attention. To march into battle with a rusted helm was to invite ridicule. Clean armour was another form of intimidation, a declaration that you were disciplined enough to control even your gear. These habits reveal how deeply hygiene tied into Viking culture. The same values applied to body and weapon alike. A comb for your hair, a scraper for your nails, and oil for your axe all carried the same weight. Cleanliness equaled control, and control equaled honour. Dirt was disorder, rust was laziness, and filth was weakness. Vikings fought these enemies with the same persistence they fought their human foes. The rituals also extended into death. Weapons buried with warriors were often polished, their surfaces gleaming even in the grave. Archaeologists note the lack of corrosion on many grave goods, suggesting they were cleaned before burial. Just as bodies were combed and washed, weapons were prepared for the afterlife. A warrior could not face Odin with a rusty sword. Even the gods were expected to notice. The daily grind of maintaining gear was relentless. Warriors spent hours sharpening, oiling, patching, and scrubbing. It was as much a part of life as bathing or eating. In a smoky longhouse filled with coughing and lice, Men bent over their swords with rags and oil, polishing away rust while smoke filled their lungs. The sight of gleaming steel in such filth was almost absurd, a perfect metaphor for Viking hygiene itself. Never clean, never free of filth, but always performing the effort. Picture the scene. You sit near the fire, your nails freshly scraped, your hair stiff with butter, your cloak heavy with grease. Beside you, a warrior rubs animal fat into his axe, polishing until it shines. Another shakes his mail shirt in a barrel of sand and vinegar, the sound clanging through the smoky hall. The air smells of butter, sweat, smoke, and rust. It is not pleasant, but it is discipline. This was Viking hygiene. The war against filth extended from scalp to shield, from fingernail to sword edge, and as the firelight glints off polished blades and freshly combed hair, you realise that the rituals of cleanliness did not end with tools or weapons. They extended to the home itself. The longhouse, filthy as it was, demanded its own rituals of order. Smoke, pests and filth filled the air, yet the Vikings still fought to keep their homes habitable. Hygiene was never victory. It was survival, repeated endlessly in body, weapon and house alike. The blade gleams with grease and vinegar, the shield is patched with leather, and the warrior's hands are raw from polishing. But behind the shine of a weapon and beard sits the heart of Viking life, the longhouse, where hygiene was not a victory but a constant surrender. To step inside was to enter a world of smells layered so thick that even the gods might turn away. The longhouse was the centre of Viking existence. Built from timber, turf or stone depending on the region, it was both fortress and family room. Dozens of people slept, ate, and worked together under a single roof, and livestock often shared the space. Sheep, goats, and sometimes even cattle lived inside for warmth, their breath mixing with the smoke of the central hearth. Imagine a barnyard and a living room stitched into one, heated not by a chimney but by the permanent cough of fire and manure. Archaeological excavations of longhouse floors reveal thick layers of waste. Over years, straw bedding, food scraps, ash and animal droppings built up into compacted layers of filth. Each layer tells a story of survival, where filth was shoveled aside rather than removed. Floors were rarely scrubbed clean. Instead, new straw was added on top, trapping old waste beneath. The result was a living surface that smelled of damp straw, smoke and decomposition, a mattress for parasites that leapt at every opportunity. Ventilation was almost non-existent. Most longhouses lacked chimneys, so smoke from the hearth hung thick in the air, staining rafters black. Windows were tiny slits or absent entirely. Light struggled to pierce the gloom, leaving interiors dim and smoky. For all their grooming rituals, Vikings spent much of their lives squinting through haze, lungs lined with soot, skin covered in greasy residue. Archaeologists examining skeletal remains note lesions on ribs, evidence of lung infections common in such environments. The longhouse was protection, but it was also poison. The smells were unforgettable. Fresh meat hung from rafters, preserved by smoke but dripping grease onto the floor. Fish dried along walls, their oil soaking into wood and straw. Chamber pots and latrine pits nearby added another layer of odour. Sweat, manure, smoke, and fish combined into what could only be described as the perfume of Viking life. Outsiders wrote about it with horror, but for those who lived there, it was the smell of home. Hygiene within the longhouse relied on routine. Bedding of straw was replaced when it became too damp or too infested with fleas, though never often enough. Cloaks and tunics were hung near the fire to dry, absorbing yet more smoke. Ash from the hearth was sometimes used as a cleaning agent, rubbed onto skin or clothing to absorb grease. Even so, the accumulation of filth was impossible to avoid. To live in a longhouse was to surrender to layers of dirt, each year adding another crust of survival. Yet there was order in the chaos. Longhouses were divided into sections. benches along the sides for sleeping, central hearth for cooking, storage areas for food and tools. Archaeologists studying these layouts find evidence of careful planning, where even filth had its place. Fire kept the cold at bay, animals provided warmth, and straw absorbed waste. Hygiene was never about removing dirt. It was about containing it. Communal living also shaped social hygiene. Privacy did not exist. You woke with your family, neighbours, and livestock around you. Every cough, every scratch, every trip to the chamber pot was witnessed. Grooming became a public performance. You combed your hair in front of others, scraped your nails where all could see, and plucked stray hairs without shame. Cleanliness was not private. It was communal, reinforced by constant observation. Parasites thrived in this environment. Fleas, lice, and mites lived in straw bedding, leapt onto clothing, and spread quickly through the crowded hall. Archaeological studies of Viking latrines show parasite eggs preserved for centuries, proof of widespread infestation. Even when longhouses were abandoned, the soil retained evidence of worms and fleas that had once fed on human and animal hosts. The longhouse itself became a breeding ground, its walls steeped in filth, invisible but unrelenting. The psychological toll must have been immense. Imagine coughing through the night as smoke stings your eyes, scratching at flea bites while straw rustles beneath you, listening to the snores of family members and the bleating of goats. The air heavy, the floor damp, the smell overwhelming. Yet this was the pinnacle of Viking domestic life. To live in a longhouse was to survive, and survival meant accepting filth as permanent company. Despite this, pride remained. Archaeologists uncovered decorated household items, combs carved with patterns, tweezers polished smooth, even ornamental pins for cloaks. In the middle of filth, Vikings still pursued beauty. Clean nails and combed hair stood out against smoky gloom, small acts of defiance in a world where dirt always won. Hygiene was not perfection. It was pride in the attempt. Picture the longhouse at night. Smoke coils upward, rafters drip with grease, fleas leap in the straw, families huddle beneath wool cloaks, animals shift in their pens, the air thick with the smell of fish and manure. A man scrapes his nails clean with a bronze tool. A woman combs her hair by firelight. Children scratch at flea bites until they bleed. It is not clean. It is never clean. But it is life, endured together in a haze of smoke and dirt. And as the fire smoulders lower and the air grows heavier, you realise hygiene was never confined to body or house. It extended into ritual, religion, and magic. Cleanliness and filth carried symbolic weight, tied to purity, fate, and the unseen powers that guided Viking life. The gods themselves became part of the battle against dirt, and rituals of cleansing reached far beyond soap and comb. Cleanliness in the Viking world was never only about removing dirt. It carried symbolic weight, binding the living to the gods and the unseen. To wash was to cross between worlds, between filth and fate, between daily struggle and cosmic order. In a society where survival left little room for luxury, bathing and ritual washing stood out as acts of almost spiritual significance. Contrary to popular images of unwashed savages, Vikings valued water. Archaeological evidence and written accounts both point to regular bathing, especially when compared to their contemporaries in medieval Europe. Streams, rivers, and hot springs were all pressed into service as public bathrooms. Weekly bathing was not unusual, and some accounts even describe more frequent washing. A 9th century cleric writing from England noted with disdain that Scandinavians bathed every Saturday, a habit he found both strange and suspicious. His disapproval was less about hygiene and more about the alarming fact that clean hair and skins seemed to make these foreign men unusually attractive to local women. Bathhouses were common in Scandinavian settlements. In Iceland and other volcanic regions, natural hot springs were harnessed, providing warm communal pools. These were not only places to scrub, but also to socialise. to conduct negotiations and to arrange marriages. The steam and heat turned washing into ceremony, where soap made from animal fat and ash was lathered onto skin until grease and sweat lifted away. Excavations even show remains of stone-lined bathhouses, evidence of permanent structures built for ritualized washing. Soap itself was a Viking invention of sorts. While other parts of Europe relied more on water alone, Scandinavians boiled animal fat with ash to create a lye-based substance. This soap was harsh, capable of stripping grease and even lightening hair. There is reason to believe that Vikings used it not only to clean but to bleach their hair, giving it a brighter, almost golden look. Blonde hair carried prestige, and bleaching became part of grooming. Imagine sitting by a smoky fire, scrubbing not just to remove dirt but to turn dark hair pale, sacrificing scalp comfort for social admiration. Washing was tied to ritual events as well. Before sacrifices, worshippers cleansed themselves. Before feasts, guests washed hands and faces in communal bowls of water passed around the hall. Cleanliness was a prerequisite for ritual purity, a way of showing respect to gods, ancestors, and honoured guests. Even burial customs involved careful washing of the dead, dressing them in clean garments before sending them to the grave or the flames of a ship burial. Dirt was not only physical, it was spiritual, and removing it prepared the body for transitions between worlds. The sagas describe moments where washing carried moral weight. In some stories, refusing to wash was a sign of dishonour, associated with madness, outcast status, or contempt. A warrior who ignored cleanliness risked being seen as less than human, a break in the social contract that bound the community. Grooming tools found in graves, combs, tweezers, ear picks, show that even in death, cleanliness was considered part of identity. To be buried with a comb was to carry order and respectability into the afterlife. But water was not always abundant. In winter, streams froze and rivers iced over. Bathing became a luxury rather than routine. Washing bowls and sponges substituted, with limited water heated over fires. This made the Saturday bath even more significant, a weekly act of renewal in a world where filth could overwhelm. The irony is that while Europeans mocked the habit, it likely contributed to Vikings enjoying better health and fewer skin infections than many of their neighbours. Regular bathing, even if harsh and smoky, kept parasites somewhat in check and removed at least a layer of filth from daily life. Communal washing also provided opportunities for display. Cleanliness was attractive, and Vikings knew it. Accounts from Anglo-Saxon chronicles note that Viking men were admired for their appearance, even envied. Their combed hair, trimmed beards, and clean clothing made them stand out in societies where dirt was more casually accepted. It was not only about personal comfort, it was strategy. To be clean was to be noticed, to be desirable, and to be feared. Ritual washing extended into warfare. Before battles, warriors sometimes washed themselves and their weapons, seeking both practical sharpness and symbolic purity. The act of scrubbing a blade, of cleaning armour, was tied to preparing the spirit as much as the body. Dirt and blood were inevitable, but beginning from cleanliness was a way of setting order before chaos. Archaeologists examining deposits near battlefield sites have found traces of soap and combs, suggesting that hygiene followed even to the edge of violence. The gods themselves were tied to ideas of cleanliness. Njord, associated with the sea, was connected to purity and washing. Rituals to Odin or Thor often involve sprinkling with water, a cleansing not only of body but of spirit. The line between bathing and blessing blurred, and cleanliness became a way of drawing closer to divine forces. The water that scoured dirt also carried spiritual weight, a reminder that purity was both physical and metaphysical. Picture the bathhouse at dusk. Steam rises, men and women gather, soap bubbles glisten in torchlight. Jokes echo against stone walls as hair is bleached, beards combed, bodies scrubbed raw. A boy sits on the edge, waiting for his turn, nervous but proud, clutching a carved comb passed down from his father. This is more than hygiene. It is tradition, expectation, ritual. To wash is to belong. And when you step from the heat into the cold night air, skin raw and steaming, hair stiff with lye, you carry not only cleanliness, but identity. The longhouse may choke with smoke, fleas may leap in the straw, but for that moment, you are clean, honoured, part of the rhythm that links mortals to gods. Viking hygiene was never perfect, but it was constant, deliberate, and sacred. Which leads naturally into the dirt they could never wash away, the hidden creatures clinging to skin and hair no matter how much lye or hot water they endured. Parasites, infections, and the unseen armies that turned every Viking body into a battlefield of itching and discomfort. And that's where we'll leave you tonight, freshly scrubbed in lye soap that burns more than it cleans, and probably crawling with a flea or two you missed in the steam. If you enjoyed soaking in the misery of Viking hygiene, let me know in the comments what kind of historical suffering you'd like me to drag you through next. And if you can't get enough of lice, filth, and questionable traditions, be sure to check out my other videos, because here we specialise in turning history into the worst possible bedtime story.